The International Monetary Fund warns that many countries will enter recession next year, calling it a dangerous new era.
Turmoil deepens in Downing Street as UK Prime Minister Liz Truss sacks Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor in a bid to stabilise the economy.
The war in Ukraine overshadows this year's Russia-Central Asia summit in Astana. Vladimir Putin says he does not regret his full-scale invasion.
Two brothers plead guilty to the 2017 murder of Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed in a car bomb. They now face 40 years in prison.
Grey clouds over the global economic horizon. The International Monetary Fund says severe inflationary pressures caused by supply-demand imbalances, pandemic-era policies and the war in Ukraine is having a severe impact.
We are entering a new dangerous zone, a world that is more fragmented, more fragile and more prone to shocks that can quickly knock countries off course.
The IMF forecasts that many countries will enter recession next year. And the shifts from a relatively stable global economy, low interest rates and low inflation to a diametrically opposite one will make global cooperation more difficult.
Turmoil within Britain's government has deepened with the sacking of Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Prime Minister Liz Truss, a close friend of Kwarteng, said she was replacing him to stabilise the economy after his planned controversial tax cuts had spooked the financial markets. Despite having devised those reforms with Kwarteng, Truss said he had to go.
Good afternoon. I met the former Chancellor earlier today. I was incredibly sorry to lose him. He is a great friend, and he shares my vision to set this country on the path to growth. Today, I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country.
The appointment of Jeremy Hunt is seen as an attempt to reassure the markets and voters that the government is turning away from radical monetarist policies that had been so unpopular with both. They had caused a collapse in support for the Conservatives, handing an almost unprecedented lead in the polls to the opposition. A lead that top party figures feared would be insurmountable ahead of elections in 2 years.
The war in Ukraine overshadowed this year's Russia-Central Asia summit held in Astana. Russian President Vladimir Putin met with leaders of former Soviet republics who did not hide their concern about what is happening in Ukraine, a country that was also part of the USSR. Now, all eyes are on whether the leader will attend the G20 summit. Even in Astana, reporters asked if he will be seeing the US president soon.
You have to ask him if he's ready to hold this negotiation with me. Frankly speaking, I see no necessity.
Putin also talked about an alleged connection between the humanitarian corridors transporting Ukrainian grain with the attack on a bridge in Crimea, dropping a veiled threat.
The Federal Security Service said that most of the so-called cargo, you can call them explosives, was sent by sea from Odessa. But it's not yet verified if it was done with the help of the cargo ships carrying grain. If it is found that the humanitarian corridor was used for committing the terrorist attacks, of course, it would question the existence of this humanitarian corridor.
Asked whether he regretted launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian president said if he had not done so, the situation would be much worse for his country.
Two brothers in Malta have been sentenced in the murder of an anti-corruption journalist that shocked the small European nation. Alfred and George De Giorgio pled guilty on Friday to the car bomb murder, hours after initially entering not guilty pleas. The pair now face 40 years in prison for Daphne Caruana Galizia's death 5 years ago. Caruana Galizia was killed on October 16, 2017, when the bomb was planted in her car. The explosion was large enough to cause the car to fly over a wall and into a field. She was just 53 years old. Before her death, she investigated the Panama Papers leak and discovered corruption in the highest levels of the Maltese government. The attack shocked the country, which serves as a major financial haven in the Mediterranean, and led to the resignation of then Prime Minister Joseph Muscat. Several other suspects are still awaiting trial for their alleged involvement in the case, including a prominent businessman.
Opposition deputies in Turkey expressed their fury on Friday at a law that further restricts press and social media freedoms in the country. In a surprising act of protest, one opposition lawmaker smashed his mobile phone during a speech to the National Assembly, denouncing the bill which claims to combat disinformation, but which the EU fears could be used to crack down on independent reporting.
We fear that it may further curtail freedoms, freedom of expression and independent media in Turkey. And we are also particularly concerned about the provision of the law that stipulates imprisonment for the crime of disinformation.
The law was passed with the support of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's governing party and nationalist allies. And with the run-up to next year's election on the horizon, critics are concerned the law may be used to silence dissenting voices.
A pair of climate activists have thrown soup on one of the world's most recognizable paintings, Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers, before gluing themselves to the wall. They are part of a group called Just Stop Oil, which is calling for an end to new oil and gas projects in the UK.
What is worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food? Worth more than justice? Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people? The cost of living crisis is part of the cost of oil crisis. Fuel is unaffordable to millions of cold, hungry families. They can't even afford to heat a tin of soup.
The painting, which hangs behind glass, was unharmed by the attack. The demonstrators have been arrested on suspicion of criminal damage and aggravated trespass. The action is just the latest climate protest in the UK as the government opens new licensing applications for North Sea oil and gas exploration.
1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence in the European Union, according to data from the EU's Agency for Fundamental Rights. Many of the abused, former models working in the fashion industry. Victims from a number of different countries opened up this week in the European Parliament.
We are fighting not only sexual abuse by powerful predatory men, some linked to organised crime, but also fighting a legal system that stops us obtaining justice.
Rape and sexual assault destroy a person's sense of identity, safety, and trust in others.
Ebba P. Karlsson from Sweden is one of the models who's written a book about her ordeal, and she's willing to share some advice.
You might want to reach out to an organisation first, and you can find them, they're all online. But definitely that's the first thing. Know that also that it's not your fault, so and know that you're not alone. So when I started sharing my book, I realized I wasn't alone, and then there was actually a lot more people, and we all came together and realized we need to do something. We actually have a case here. We need to make a change in the law so people like us can be protected.
Last March, the European Commission proposed to treat gender-based violence as a, quote, serious crime with a cross-border dimension. The new directive is now being considered by members of the European Parliament. It would provide clear rules for criminal definitions and sanctions.
It is imperative that procedures and care for victims can intervene quickly. That is, when a victim comes to make a complaint, it must be taken in charge, that the file is immediately passed on to the public prosecutor, and that there is a criminal response adapted to the fact that she has reported it. We need harmonisation at European level, perhaps later at international level, to give a boost to our legislation.
The current proposal includes measures to prevent, protect and effectively prosecute crimes including online harassment. Maeve McMahon, Euronews, Brussels.